Um, Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to another Insight Series lecture. Today we have with us Dr. Roluah Puia from IIT Roorkee. He'll be talking to us about his book, Nationalism in the Vernacular, State, Tribes, and the Politics of Peace in Northeast India. This book is an outcome of his PhD thesis, and it has evolved over time to make a very substantive argument about the Mizo people, and I feel that given the spirit of the Insight series, it was a pertinent topic, and hence I'm very happy that he accepted our invitation and he's here with us in person. I'll give a brief abstract about the book, after which I will invite my student Tong to formally introduce the lecture and the speaker. This talk will focus on the relationship between orality and nationalist politics at two levels through the lens of the Mizo case in Northeast India. The first level centers around the creation of the vernacular language and idioms, which reframes and reconstructs the Mizo nationalist ideas and the politics of peace. The second level explicates the irrepressibility of the oral vernacular idioms and practices of the Mizo nationalist movement. This brings into analytical focus the multiple oral forms of expression, such as Patihla, the party songs, Hanamla, the national song, and Rambhoihla, the songs for troubled times. The vernacularization of nationalist ideas, idioms, practices leverages the people's agency to construct their own sense of understanding of their nation. Drawing upon in-depth fieldwork and interviews, as well as archive materials gleaned from a fieldwork spanning more than a year, this talk will focus on the connection and circulation of nationalist ideas and how do they intersect with orality, vernacular idioms, and practices across borders and regions. This is the book on which today's talk will be based. I've ordered a copy for the library, so hopefully it should be arriving soon. So with that, I'll invite my student Tong to formally inaugurate the lecture and the speaker. Thank you, Professor Assis. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a special Insight Series lecture hosted by the Humanities and Social Science Department, IIT Gandhinagar. The Insight Series lecture began in 2022 by Professor Assis Khakha with a focused development on indigenous peoples issues. Previous luminaries who have graced the lecture include P. Sainath, Professor Rashid Khalidi, Professor Muhammad Mamdani, and Professor Edgar Nausoner, Professor Terry Cannon, Professor David Samley, Professor Chandan Sharma, and today we are very fortunate to have Dr. Roluah Puia from IIT Roorkee. Dr. Roluah Puia obtained PhD from Tata Institute of Social Science, Guwahati. He has held teaching and fellow position at Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, New Delhi, and IIT Guwahati. And he is currently serving as an assistant professor at the Department of Humanities and Social Science in IIT Roorkee. He was awarded Arvind Raghunathan and Sribala Subramaniam South Asian Visiting Fellowship in 2018 and 19 at the South Asian Institute, Harvard University, United States. His published work has appeared in noted journals like Asian Ethnicity, Contemporary Southeast Asia, Economic and Political Weekly, Asian, Journal of Borderland Studies, Nations and Nationalism, and his book, Nationalism in the Vernacular, States, Tribes, and Politics of Peace in Northeast India, 2023, was published by Cambridge University. Dr. Puia's research interest broadly covers, among others, identity, nationalism, development, and border studies. Today, he will be talking to us about a very important topic, that is nationalism in the vernacular, state, tribes, and politics of peace in Northeast India. With this brief introduction, let's welcome Dr. Roluah Puia and Professor. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Tom, for that very generous introduction. And also, I would like to express my gratitude to the Department of Humanities and Social Science at IIT Gandhinagar for this wonderful opportunity. And also, I'm someone who have been following the activities of the department, so deeply inspired. And also, Tong has mentioned some of the names and speakers who have been invited by ASIS. So they are scholars from whom I have read, learned, and seek my inspiration till today. So I really feel privileged to be given this opportunity. And thank you everyone for coming, and also for those of you who are joining the lecture from online. Well, I am not trained in any discipline till my postgraduate, and it was only when I worked with Professor Virginius Kaka for my PhD that I pretend to think like a sociologist, but it has remained very difficult for me because I follow largely multidisciplinary kind of thinking in my work, and many scholars who have read some of my books, my book have expressed their surprise in terms of me dealing with songs, for example. So also the other is that I'm not a very good orator. I have my PPT. So, but then, most of the time I'll be, reading out, from my text so that, I make sense, and I will try to make sense. Okay. So the book is titled Nationalism in the Vernacular, State, Tribes, and the Politics of Peace in Northeast India. Now, the book is, I have been working on it for some years now. Like Ashish said, it was part of my doctoral project. And then I take it forward during my fellow positions in Center for the Study of Developing Societies, and then a one-year position in Harvard, and then again in IIT Guwahati. So, it has been a culmination of, probably 9 years of, struggling to write and think about Mizo nationalism. So, yeah, in the book, on the right side, you have the book cover. So I try to make three interrelated arguments. One is the broader framework or the broader argument, which is exploring the relationship between orality and nationalist politics. And I examine this relationship through the vernacularization of politics and nationalist ideas by exploring the divergent ways in which Mizo community or Mizos localize expressions by using terms such as Zalen, that is freedom, Ramle and Hamtan for territory and nation, and also exploring the different genres of hla, that is songs such as party hla, songs largely composed by individuals or members of political party advocating the agenda or manifestos of political parties. Second is namhla, that is national songs, and the third is rambuaihla, songs of troubled times. Now, I argue that this was vernacularization at work, where political ideas and imaginations, idioms and practices, loss and suffering were articulated in the local that reflected the agency of the Mizos. So let me go, a little backward. So I developed, this idea of working on Mizo politics when I was doing my master in TIS Bombay. So many times, I was asked this question, what is there left to study, given that, the movement is already over in the year 1986. And also because today, Mizoram as a state, particularly in the context of Northeast India, has remained more or less, peaceful. Now, so the same thing happened, when I enrolled myself as an MPhil scholar in TISS, where my doctoral committee, advised me to work on a different topic. However, I remain adamant And, because it's a topic, that I always think that, needs to be rewritten or, reworked. Also because, spending 5 years of my academic life in TISS in Bombay, there was also a feeling that, there was never a chance that uh, the issue of the Northeast or say tribals at large were, discussed in any kind of, course that we study. So there was also, a feeling of alienation within me that, how much the course, work that I study or the topics that were discussed in the class address, that some of the concerns that people from the region are facing. So with that kind of thing in mind, another part of my struggle was also that, although, this is, very diverse, but there was a struggle in a sense that, faculties and, your peers will say that they don't know anything about the Northeast. So it was, at this kind of juncture that I made up my mind that, I think it is time for me to go back. So fortunately, Ashish's father went back to TISS Guwahati. So I expressed my, interest to go back. And then he said that, let's see what you can write. Then I took the risk and I went back to TISS. So in Guwahati. So this was, a little background. And also because much of the literatures on the Northeast remains very problematic in terms of their, misrepresentation about the, about the reason, about the people. So what, many decolonial scholars call epistemic violence. So it was, this kind of hunger and, quench in mind that, I started, thinking more deeply about, Mizo politics, Mizo socio-political history. So now, some of the questions, to which I pursue this work is, can we think about Mizo nationalism beyond the MNF movement? The MNF movement, the armed violence started in the year 1966. It ended in 1986. Now, the first question that I have in mind is that can we think Mizo nationalism beyond the MNF? And the other is that what does Mizo nationalism mean to the non-MNF members before, and what does it mean today? So for instance, does the end of the Mizo movement, the armed movements in 1986, does it also mean that, Mizo nationalism ended with the Mizo Accord? And how do ordinary Mizo people perceive and construct their sense of nationalism? So these are some of, the questions, that guide my work. Now, so in my book, I open my introduction with a protest that engulfed Mizoram in the year 2018. The protest was organized by the Mizo civil society organizations, such as the Central Young Mizo Organization, which is one of the largest civil bodies in Mizoram. Student groups like the Mizo Zirlaipo, that is the Mizo Students Federation, under the banner of what in Mizo we call Nam Matlang, that is a voluntary action to come out and protest, that demanded the removal of SB Shashank, who was the then chief election commissioner over the issue of electoral politics in the state. So in Mizoram's recent past, there were political mobilizations that the state has witnessed on such a massive or extensive scale was something which was very, very new. Now, as a student of ethnicity and nationalism, my own reading of the protest was that, there were two very crucial features about it. One was that the protests were held under the banner of Mizo Nam Natlang, that is a call upon the Mizo public to come out together in protest against the chief electoral commissioner of the state to save their Nam. Nam can be translated as clan, tribe, or nation. So the Mizo sense of being a community is informed by their idea of Nam. So the Nam consciousness, like I said, can relate to either being a clan, tribe, ethnicity, or nation. The other part of the protest was a lesser recognized and acknowledged aspect was the circulation of national songs during the protest. So it is an age of social media and Instagram, WhatsApp status, WhatsApp forward were flooded with posters that carry, national songs, like the one that is there in my slide. So in Mizo political history, Puro Kunga, the composer of this song, so I have my translation in the later part of my slide. Puro Kunga, the composer of these songs, he composed much of his songs which he composed in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s were widely popular and continue to remain so till today. So in the Namnatlang, Purokung songs resurface and saw a new kind of revival. And it to a very large extent, also enable us to understand Mizo political culture. So by and large, my contention and argument is that the political soul of the Mizos lies in the relationship between orality and songs, orality and nationalist politics, where songs played a very, very pivotal role. Now, this is beyond my book. Now, today, given the kind of political crisis in the Indo-Myanmar borderlands, what we have again is, how songs in particular, remain instrumental in a situation of crisis. For example, post the military coup in Myanmar in 2021, Mizoram has, Mizoram has acted against the direction of the central government to deport and detect refugees from Myanmar. On the contrary, Mizo public and the state government of Mizoram has initiated several charity concerts to support refugees from Myanmar. Another is in the current ongoing intercommunal conflict between Métis and the Kukis that erupted in May which is also an ongoing conflict. Again, the Mizo public has come out in large numbers in support of the Kukis and Mizo refugees. Now, what has again emerged as a very important tool of political mobilization and affirming social ties is the use of songs. Popular singers across the state were being hired, were mobilizing themselves voluntarily to support the refugees from Myanmar. Now, in my work, I do not come to this extent, but just to lay or to note that how songs, different genres of songs continue to play an instrumental role, or continue to be very important when you try to understand and approach Mizo politics. Okay, so coming to my book, so on the right side you see the darker stage. That is where I have conducted my fieldwork. So I did my fieldwork in Mizoram, Manipur, the southern part of Manipur adjoining Mizoram, and the Zampui Hills in Tripura. So in chapter 2 and 3, I locate the emergence of Mizo nationalism within the context of the tribal question in India. Now, the tribal question in India is largely taught within the tribal question in India is commonly framed within the debate, what is commonly known as the Gurri-Elwin debate or the integration isolationist debate. Now, politically, when one talks about the tribal question in India, we go back to this debate, the Gurri-Elwin debate. Now, the problem is that where scholars like Bangya Buki argues is that the integration and isolation is totally silence the voice of the tribes. There is no tribes. Basically, we're not allowed to speak. So therefore, I try to go beyond this integration isolationist debate by locating the socio-political positions of the Mizos during the 1940s and the 1950s. So I look at particularly the contribution of Mizo Union, which is the first political party in Mizoram, where I argue that modern Mizo political consciousness was homegrown. The other aspect that I look at is the idea of Mizo nationalism was not only a brainchild of the Mizo National Front per se, but political parties such as the Mizo Union, although they were pro-integrationists in terms of supporting the integration of Mizoram with the Indian Union, they were quite nationalist in terms of their political objectives. So now coming to the question of orality and nationalism, oral culture in the form of La, particularly in Mizo society, were the predominant means of expression. So until the late 19th century, the Mizo communities have no writing systems. And it was only with the coming of the British and the colonial, when, particularly, the colonial missionaries targeting them for conversions, that writing system began to develop among the Mizos. However, even till today, orality or oral culture in the form of songs in Mizo society continue to occupy a very, very important place. Now, for example, even if you're a traveler, if you get a chance to visit Mizoram, you will see that many oral forms continue to survive in Mizo society. For example, even in Aizawl, we continue to have klang out, that is, the village crier. So the YMA, have these klang out systems we have different forms of collective singing, such as Lengkhomzai. So the practice of orality has a strong cultural context where knowledge and histories are transmitted orally. And for a society that primarily relied on oral communication, the practice is deeply interwoven into their social fabric, and it was easily receptible to the larger community. Now, political parties such as the Mizo Union and the MNF, among others, even contemporary, even more recent political parties like the ZPM, the Zoran People's Movement, continue to use and creatively tap into the oral culture of the Mizos to disseminate their political ideas and imaginations. So in terms of my methods, I did a multi-sited field work, like I said, in Mizoram, Manipur, and Tripura. And my objective was not necessarily to compare and contrast, what happened in Mizoram or what happened in Manipur, but trying to integrate the experience of the people during the 20 years of armed struggles. So Mizo community, Mizos as a community, we are used to what we call TT, that is an unstructured conversation. Hence, for my study, an in-depth interview made a very, very suitable choice. For instance, I came to Gandhinagar, there is Krishna. So today, he called me, we have TT for 3-4 hours, right? So Mizos, we are very, used to having this TT, right? Family gather together, meet, in informal, formal occasions, we are used to having this very, very informal, unstructured conversation. Now, when I conducted interview also, it always started with TT, like, where are you from? What did your father do? Which village you are from? This and that. So generally, the interviews, I conducted with more than 70, 80 respondents. Interviews were quite long because of, the kind of, Mizo's love for TT. So people start with their personal background, they talk about, the kind of sacrifice that they made, but also, it revolves around, many things. But the use of, qualitative in-depth interview was really, really suitable, particularly in the context of my own work. Now, when interviewing or when approaching my research respondents, particularly the former MNF rebels, what struck me was the fact that many of them identified themselves as song composers. Now, for instance, the current chief minister of Mizoram, who himself was, a member of the MNF, he has composed several songs. Likewise, the MNF rebels, who are in the lower rung of the organization, also, boast themselves as, composing battalion songs, composing, different songs related to maybe love songs, Christian hymns, so on and so forth. Now, also in my conversation with my research respondents, none of them referred the movement as insurgency or conflict, but rather they categorically referred to it as Zalen Naswal, that is freedom movement, and the struggle as Ramle Namtan, that is territory and nation. Now, if you go to say, much of the literature written about, movements like the MNF, what we have is that, it is largely depicted as insurgency or socio-political movements in the Northeast, despite, their varying conditions in which they emerge, academic literatures club them homogeneously as insurgency. Now, the use of insurgency can be very, very helpful, but it homogenizes, and it is a very, very simplistic account. Does not really tell us, the story of the larger questions that this movement were posing. So subsequently, I began to locate and identify how different genres of songs emerged before and after the movement. And so one part of the significance of songs and its relation to politics was that it democratized Mizo political culture. So Mizo political culture, even till today, is very, very democratized in a sense that, democracy was established from below. So my work draws upon a combination of in-depth qualitative interviews with more than 70 individuals, inclusive of both former MNF and non-MNF members. I have, liberally used field notes, photographs, observations, archival materials from national and international institutions, newspaper archives, files of personal collections in the form of photographs, diaries, and monographs for my work. Now, understanding Mizo politics. Now, the democratization of Mizo political culture is important to understand even contemporary Mizo politics. For example, when Christopher Jaffelot argues that, the rise of the plebeians in North India. So in Mizo society, the commoners have, emerged as a strong political force way before what the mainland part of India has witnessed. So till today, politics in Mizo society remain a bipolar contest in a sense that political rivalries or political competitions largely happen between two warring groups. One is the Mizo. The first is the Mizo Union in the United Mizo Freedom Organization. The second is the Mizo Union in the Mizo National Front, and then the Congress and the People's Conference. And today we have the Congress and the MNF. Now, like I said, Mizo political culture is rooted in grassroots politics, and this was enabled by the abolishment of chieftainship in the year 1954 that puts an end to the chief rules and paved the way for the rise of the commoners. Now, the older Mizo society was divided into two broad classes. One is the chiefs and the other is the commoners. Now, traditionally, the chiefs were highly revered and they enjoy certain privileges in the form of tax collection, land ownership, and everyday governance in the village. Now, by and large, chieftainship as an institution was integral to Mizo political structure. However, with colonialism, the nature of chieftainship, has undergone significant transformation of, what Mahmud Mamdani has called, they have more or less become a decentralized despots in a sense that, the role or the role of the chiefs during colonial period was limited to, say, collecting taxes. So they were no longer seen as, protector of the village, but rather, they were seen by the people as a burden. Now, if you look on the right side of the slide, you will see, this was the first Mizo Union Assembly, and it happened in the year 1946. Now, the Mizo Union, led the movement towards the movement for the abolishment of chieftainship, and it was supported, by the vast majority of Mizos, not only within Mizoram, but also in Tripura as well as Manipur. So the Mizo Union played a very, very important role in terms of the formation of Mizo District Council under the 6th Schedule that gives power to the people. So now I'm coming to the third and the fourth chapter. So often, it is commonly assumed that the administrative and political exclusion of the tribes in the Northeast have resulted into the feeling of separation or feeling of alienation among the communities. But contrarily, what I tried to show is that the hill regions such as Lusai Hills, today Mizoram, saw political mobilization that questioned colonial power towards the tribes, colonial policies towards the tribes, and in fact challenged the legitimacy of the colonial state. Although Indian nationalist movement does not necessarily penetrate into these tribal areas, it was not that there was no anti-British sentiment. Anti-British sentiment in Lusai Hills was very, very strong. And the Mizos, have largely protest against, the exclusion of Mizos within the larger colonial political structure. So the last 2 decades of colonial rule in Lusai Hills were marked by resistance and confrontation between Mizo commoners and the British. One, the Mizo challenged the colonial policy of exclusion on the ground that it denied them political rights and participation. Now, if you look at today's Northeast, largely the tribal areas, they were put under partially excluded and excluded areas. Now, in these regions, normal civil rights, political, administrative rules were not applicable. So it means that, they were administratively and politically excluded. Now, from the 1920s onwards, what we see is that there were a feeling of resentment against, colonial policies. One was a significant event in Mizo history is, that Telela and his friends, they demanded that, Mizos should be given the right to have political representation. So in response to their demand, the British, have arrested them and they were put behind bars. Likewise, the demand for political representation began to take a more organized form with the emergence of Mizo Union in the 1940s. Now, from the time of its establishment, the Mizo Union confronted the colonial state and anti-British sentiment grew among the commoners. Now, the Mizo Union were largely very, very pro-integrationists in terms of supporting, the larger idea of democratic India. And it was the promise of democratic rule that draws the Mizo Union and their supporters towards joining the Indian Union. For example, a slogan which was popular during the time reads, "What do we want to join Indian Union? Why? To abolish the chiefs." So on the right side, you will see, a slogan which was being raised by the Mizo Union supporters. I'm just going to, I'll quickly read, the English version. Mizo Union for our nation. Have we got freedom? No, we have not. What did we get? Serf rule, let it be gone. Chiefs rule, let it be gone. Superintendent Peter, let him be gone. What should we do if he is not gone? We will disobey his orders. So during between the year 1946 and 1952, that is until the enforcement of Sixth Schedule, several non-cooperation movements were launched against the British, from defying the orders of the chiefs, attacking their houses, stone pelting, and collective protests ranging from rallies were organized. Mizo society has seen a socio-political transformation of the commoners' rise to power, both socially and politically. And it was during this time that Party Hla began to emerge, acting as an essential medium to disseminate party ideologies and manifestos. Now, it was not that, the British were not responding to the kind of political demands or political mobilizations that the Mizo Union were leading. For example, the British, particularly the political superintendents, made a concerted effort to suppress any kind of political mobilizations in Mizo Hills. Now, these were some of the orders, that were being issued. For instance, I'm just going to read the third one. Mizo Union is an illegitimate, self-appointed organization of people who were habituated of talking about governance and society in public. It does not have any legitimate basis of authority and representation. It is only the conference members who have the sole authority to proclaim it as being representative of the people. Any other individuals or parties who consider themselves as representing the people are at best deceiving themselves, and in the worst case, they are like fascists, ascribing to Hitler's fascist rule. Fascist governments question democratic governance and challenge them by granting themselves de facto rule. It is deplorable when it succeeds and a matter of shame if it fails. I inform you in your union to remember this. Now, this is a letter which was issued by L.L. Peters, who was the political superintendent of the time. So, between the year 1946 and the 1950s, Party Hla began to take root in Mizo Hills, and political parties, mainly the Mizo Union and the United Mizo Freedom Organization, have used songs to mobilize themselves. Now, volunteers belonging to, say, Mizo Union, with whom I have, interacted with, narrated, the kind of energy and enthusiasm with which, songs were being sung in open fields. Now, rival political parties, such as the United Mizo Freedom Organization and Mizo Union, they will compete themselves in open ground, challenging, whose policies are better. And it was songs which was used as a weapon and an ammunition to counter one another. So two-party democratic politics get entrance, where both the elites and the commoners participated actively in constructing and shaping the discourse. And the link between democracy and politics was made through the oral, making political discourse part of the everyday life of people. Now, on the right side, you see Mizo Union leaders with Pandit Nehru, the first prime minister. Now, some of the songs, for example, this is from the Mizo Union Party. I'll just quickly read them. Union never erred in its judgment. Even the chieftains are such dimwits, not knowing when to give in, yet the Union army will surely march on. Like the southern storm, they will sweep the hills. So, and another song, for instance, goes as, so we have heard Vice President Nehru, both in India and Assam, has opened the doors to freedom, much to the elation of all. No more room for the chiefs' favor outside. They have impeded the Union way, the way Union claim. Yea, though did impede, they insist miss out. There is some issue with my slide. Siesta's custom from this day since white men from the west give Darbar away, pleaded to endure just the year. This no freedom at all. For selfishness it is, second of what this is, false and acts, and shadowing the chiefs beckon. They note but deter daily course. Harsh labor is all they are. On the other hand, the United Mizo Freedom Organization advocated for the integration of Mizos with Union of Burma. For instance, they have this song, two unions, but not the same. Our union for Mizoram, your union to please the Vai. Now, Vai is a racial and a kind of racial term that is used by the Mizos to label the Plains people. So now coming to the MNF. So between the year 1959 and 1961, Mizo Hills, that is today Mizoram, were hit by a massive famine known as Mautang. Now, among several organizations, the MNF was one that emerged to provide relief and rehabilitation to the people suffering from the famine. By 1961, the famine more or less faded away. But then the experience of the famine, in many ways, established or nurtured a kind of feeling that, Mizo's political destiny does not lie with Assam or India. So several, intellectuals or several, early educated groups who were studying in Shillong, Guwahati, have these meetings with Laldenga, who is the president of the MNF, and they begin to, discuss, and talk about the possibility of the need of Mizoram to have an independent state. Now, in 1961, the MNF transformed itself as a political party. It contested elections in the by-elections in 1963. It won the MLA seats. So the 1963 elections in many ways emboldened the idea of Mizo's, desire for self-determination. Now, between this period, it also, affirmed the view, of the need of Mizos to be self-reliant economically and politically. And the other is that, even among those groups, sections of intellectuals or political leaders who were pro-integrationists at the dawn of India's independence, the feeling that, the powers that were being conferred to the district council through the sixth schedule failed to protect their political interests. Now, it reignited debates about the political status of the Mizos, that is statehood, Mizo Union, that advocated statehood for Mizoram, and independence, which is advocated by the Mizo National Front. Now, for example, the Mizo Union submitted a memorandum in 1965, so where they, express their, a feeling of betrayal, particularly, being, how, the Assam political leadership, has failed, the Mizo people. On the other hand, the MNF also submitted a memorandum in 1965 to the Prime Minister of India expressing, their desire for self-determination. Now, around this time, I'm going to take another maybe 10 minutes. So around this time, Namhla began to take over the political discourse, and Mizo Union and the MNF, started, using songs to, counter, one another. Several song composers, such as Roluah and Puia, began to be widely popular. For instance, Roluah composed a song, Romin Real Sakangse, which is considered as the national anthem. Now, even till today, in any kind of public gatherings, Mizos generally, will play the songs or sing the songs, not only in, in public gatherings, but also in official ceremonies, even in the state assemblies, in schools, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go through the song. So Namhla in many ways acted as a catalyst for mass mobilization, and due to their oral form, they successfully instilled a strong sense of national consciousness. So for instance, Pusa Bronga, who is, one of the most renowned face of the Mizo Union, narrated, how the MNF was able to mobilize the public largely through the use of songs. So the rise of the MNF in many ways for the Mizo Union was unstoppable. And so in between so immediately after the declaration of independence in 1966, counterinsurgency, started. And Mizoram has, experienced one of the most brutal insurgency in the history of independent India. For example, village grouping was implemented from the year 1967 to 1970, where close to 90% of the Mizo population were being grouped under different grouping centers. Now, likewise, Indira Gandhi, the then prime minister, also ordered the use of jet fighters to, clear much of the areas which were being held, which were being controlled by the MNF. So, and they also, any kind of there was mass censorship in terms of any kind of print materials, any kind of newspaper were being where no media was functioning except All India Radio. So there was mass censorship during the entire movement. Now, in under such kind of harsh violent conditions, Mizos fall back to the oral, and a new genre known as Rambuaita emerged in the context of India's counterinsurgency campaigns. Now, this is just an image showing that so during the period of the counterinsurgency, mobility was restricted. You are not allowed to move around until unless you have a permit from the authorities. So many the traditional life of Mizo society was largely disrupted. People were being uprooted from their homes, and many families were divided. They were separated. So, but on the contrary, since the time village grouping was implemented, there was this narrative of successful counterinsurgency. For example, a news report from Times of India reads a successful regrouping of Mizo villagers attribute to army. In many ways, yes, the village grouping was successful in terms of cutting the connections between the MNF rebels and the larger Mizo public. But the narrative is largely silent when it comes to the suffering that the civilians underwent because of the village grouping. Now, there were broadly two forms of erasure. One is the silencing of the state, or the silencing by the state in terms of the violence, suppressing the voices of the people. Now, today, if you go to Mizoram, despite the brutal years of counterinsurgency, there is no memorial sites that commemorate the violent history. There are no archival records of the village groupings. And there is no recognition of the aerial bombings and the internment that were undertaken to village groupings. Now, Rambuaila, in my own reading, act as a form of survivance, what the Native American scholars, Visioner has termed it as survivance, that activates forms of resistance to erasure and marks indigenous people's voice visible in ways counter to dominant cultural narratives. Now, through Rambuaila, I explored the language of expression against violence and retrieved the experiences in a way that preserves the way people live through them. So Rambuaila, in many ways, tell the story of what counterinsurgency do to people. Now, because I think this is important essentially because there is a total archive of silence about what the Mizo civilians have underwent, not only in the hands of the Indian security forces, but also in the hands of the MNF rebels. So I turn to the Mizo public narratives, particularly the songs, as a medium to unearth the people's experience of the counterinsurgency. Such narratives become an important area of inquiry into the Mizo movement. For example, this is one song which is composed by Suaglena, grouping the most atrocious ordeals of our time, leaving the once vibrant hamlets empty and void, as the group helpless village people gather, clueless, helpless, and left to starve and survive. So I'm just going to skip this. So this is a cemetery. On the right side is a cemetery, largely which was constructed by the MNF, the political party, when they were in power. And on the left side, we have the coffins of the Mizo national rebels who died during the period of the movement. So what does the book do? Basically, one, it specifically examines law in relation to Mizo nationalism. It interrogates this within the framework of vernacular nationalisms and locate the use of law within Mizo oral culture. It was in law that Mizos articulated their aspirations, party Hla in Namhla, for instance, and recorded their experience, that is in Rambuaila. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Puia, for this wonderful and very absorbing talk. I think one of the main services that this talk does is that it, in a way, pulls off the binders from what we have studied in the Northeast vis-a-vis the insurgent groups, as well as how can we understand the people's movements vis-a-vis oral forms and oral narratives. The idea that the dominant discourse as you rightly mentioned, homogenizes much of the movements within a particular bracket. But once you start doing fieldwork, you realize that much of this, much of the counter much of the response of the people comes from very deep-rooted cultural forms of practice, be it songs, poems, hymns. I wanted to know, and I'll begin this question, and then maybe we can hand it over to the audience, that as you mentioned that the MNF has been studied before, but what was your point of attraction towards the movement again, and why did you feel that it was imperative to study the movement from a fresh lens in order to understand the Mizo question?
Thank you, Ashish, for that question. I think it's also a very important question in the larger context of my work. Well, I will respond it in two ways. One is, I have briefly mentioned about the issue of misrepresentation. Now, by and large, this misrepresentation also entails, how the movement has been studied. So one is that, for instance, it is not only in academic, it is not only that, I refuse to use the term insurgency. So for instance, when Puzoram Thanga, who is the current chief minister of Mizoram, was interviewed by a media, by a newspaper outlet sometime in the year 2018 or 19. So he said he refused to label the MNF movement as an insurgency movement. So so if I am to appreciate and acknowledge the agency of the people who have participated and led the movement, then I think it is important to use the frame in which they would like to be represented. So also, if you look at much of the literatures on the MNF movement and the larger socio-political movements that are there in the Northeast, so like I said, it is uh, clubbed together as insurgency, and I think that is deeply problematic because yes, in many ways, there are movements, but they emerge in a very specific historical context, and also the kind of questions that they pose, right? Say for example, in the context of Assam, in the context of Mizoram is entirely different. Likewise, the other is that there is this obsession with linking the MNF movement with the famine, as if the or in the larger scholarly literature we call it the greed and the grievance explanations of why men rebel, right? So many scholars have used this framework. So rather the intention is to understand the cultural embeddedness of the cultural embeddedness, as well as the very intimate nature of politics. And it is there that one can really look at in the context of Mizo society, the oral. And that oral is not only about the MNF movement, but even if I'm to look at contemporary Mizo politics today, the contemporary Mizo politics, in many ways the oral continues to be very very relevant and significant. And to me, it is also very surprising in the sense that scholars have totally neglected this very important this very important aspect, particularly when they study Mizo society.
Just a follow-up to that question is that you've used songs. The idea of music, the idea of songs becomes central to understanding the movement. This is very similar to how the Irish had resisted the British. So if you read Richard English's work on armed struggle, the IRA's movement, it's very similar to how the Irish songs and music becomes extremely important as a counter resistance to the British. So I wanted to know where did you locate or narrow down, or in a way zero down upon the idea of songs as an expression of resistance?
Well, I think it largely touched. Your question largely touched upon the broader theoretical framework. Uh, in my case, I am inspired largely, by socio-anthropological works that looks at, uh, how ordinary people imagine and construct the idea of the nation, or the a more Within socio-anthropological literature, I am, largely inspired by the work of, say, Michael Billig, that talks about banal nationalism. But then in the context of Northeast India, largely the work of ELAP Waters, where, he have extensively studied how Nagas, have actively recreated and reframed modern democratic politics to suit their own local conditions. Now, in the context of, even in North India also, Lucia Micheluti has worked, has this book on the vernacularization of democracy. So it is this kind of work, that inspire, my own book. But at the same time, I think, what they have done is that they have put the voice of the people at the center of, their work. And, I think that is essentially important.
Okay, I'll open up the floor to the audience, and I would request you to keep your questions pointed and brief.
Thank you for your talk. Just two quick questions. I'm just a little more curious to know, I know you've already explained some of these connections, but I just want to know a little bit more about how you would distinguish between the role of oral culture in politics in general and the role of oral culture in nationalism. Because the two are not exactly synonymous, of course, right? And the reason I'm asking this question is that, again, I'm not a scholar of Northeastern India or Mizoram specifically, but generally, we do have a very rich, and some of it Ashish already pointed out, we do have a very rich transnational, international culture of patriotic music that creates a certain kind of nationalism, perhaps the kind of nationalism that vernacular nationalisms will fight in a way. But again, music would still be utilized, right? So the form is not essentially different, but maybe there would be sub differences within the form. That's what I wanted to know from you. That's the first question. The second question is, again, on a related note. You did speak towards the end about the formation of a particular genre. I'm just interested to know a little bit more about the kind of musical traditions these songs were coming from. And what were the kind of musical traditions they were tapping into? What were their reference points? Were there anything, any international inspiration, for example? Because more or less in the same period, in the 60s, we have this huge protest music culture coming all over America and everywhere, right? So were they influenced by some of these other traditions across the world? These are the two questions. Thank you so much.
Well, let me start with the second question, because the first question is a little difficult to respond. So on the second question, I think that is very pertinent in the sense that what makes the Mizo oral culture distinct, given that music and songs is pervasive all across national movements, even during the anti-colonial movements. Gandhi, Tagore, have used bhajans, in songs to spread, their ideas of nationalism. Now, I think, particularly, in the context of Mizo society, so by the 1950s and the 1960s, the society was largely Christianized, and there is always this, contest between traditions and modernity within Mizo society. So it was to a very large extent, much of the song composers, I could not, have the, I could not, discuss in detail. But the song composers, for example, Roluah, who is known as the poet of the century, they were the one who bridged the traditions and modernity, modern ideas, in terms of using Christian hymns, like the tunes of Christian hymns, in the context of Mizo society. Now, the church were, very adamant and conservatives in terms of, the continuation of anything tradition. Now, it was at that kind of juncture that, these kind of songs emerged, as a way to bridge, what I would call the pre-Christian and the post-Christian. Now, so Roluah and many others made, it acceptable for the larger majority, even for the church. Now, even within Mizo society, there were several protest, songs like counterculture against Christianity, proselytization, that went on till the 1950s. So, by the 1950s, because of the kind of political changes that were happening, so it in many ways established a new kind of culture where uh, song composers were bringing these ideas of traditions and modern, and much of the songs that were being sung were composed in the tune of Christian hymns. Now, for example, the Mizo national song is largely composed following the American national song, and we know where they take the inspiration from. But that become more acceptable. Now, if these songs were composed in the tune of Mizo traditional songs, they might not be accepted by the church, for example. So I think the song composers were very creative in terms of trying to make it not only accessible but also acceptable. Now, the role of oral in politics and oral culture in national politics. Now, well, I really don't know, but my own, I would like to understand orality as something which is in my work not only as nationalistic. So even if I say nationalism in the vernacular, my intention is not to limit the use of orality within nationalist framework. So therefore, I engage with say Rambuaitla. That is not nationalistic at all. It is composed in response to the violent counterinsurgency. That people were not allowed to write, people were not allowed to speak to the media. There was no any other avenues for people to express the kind of sufferings or the kind of experience that they had. So therefore, people fall back to the oral. So although in my work the actual nationalism uh, is just a part of it. I read it as orality. The significance of orality is much beyond nationalist politics. But I still have to think about the distinction between the role of oral in politics and oral culture in nationalist politics. But I think I will limit my response here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that fascinating talk. It was very interesting to hear about the pre-MNF articulation, the post-MNF ones. Mostly when you read about Mizo nationalism, it's either about the Motam or about the MNF. So it's nice to hear this kind of comparative assessment. My question is about La, as you said. I'm not pronouncing it correctly, I'm sure. But so this has been a pervasive tradition, all through, right from the colonial period down to the post-MNF period. It's just that the Mizo conception of territory and nation has changed, has evolved, right? From what you said, there was a strong support for the Indian Union, a resentment against British rule. Partially for a period, there was support or something, and then you come down, and there's a backlash against the Indian Union as well. If you go down to the MNF period, and of course, there's a resentment about being included in Assam and the demand for a separate state of Mizoram. Now, the whole idea of why, which David writes as also foreigner, meaning foreigner. You said plains people, but in one of his articles, he's also referring to it as a foreigner. So the conception of the foreigner is also changing all through this entire period. So at some point it's the British, at some point it's the plains people, etc. So what are the and when I think about the Motam, there was definitely an attempt, maybe a delayed attempt, but also an attempt to provide relief. Right. And there was also a sense of gratitude. And for a while, the people were happy that relief was flowing in, whatever. So through all of these, what really happens? I mean, why does it change from support to the Indian Union to removing it? I understand the Assam story, of course, but what is really happening here, and why Burma of all of all countries, and what is the kind of support for that demand? So this is my first question. The second one I'll ask later, maybe if you want, I can ask the two together. Yeah, is it fine? Okay. So the other is that the whole idea of Mizo nationalism or nationalisms, rather, it's not a straightforward or linear one, right? You have for one, you have a very strong relationship with the church. You know, Joy talks about the westernization, the adoption of Western attire, songs, etc. Church remains a very strong presence, and that tends to, complicate the whole process of vernacularization. You know, it is possible there's a vernacularization of the missionary discourse, etc. The missionaries are probably not regarded as the agents of colonial rule, you know, because they are also offering all kinds of other services, medical services being one of those. So, but is there a vernacularization that is happening at that level as well? And how does it affect Mizo nationalism, or the various versions of Mizo nationalism? How does it complicate? So these are the two questions.
Well, it's getting tougher. So again, I'm recalling, the time when the reviewers pulled me left and right. So trying to really streamline one's thought, right? So with the church and the MNF and the process of vernacularization. So for a long time, particularly when the movement started, the relationship between the church and the MNF was very, very bitter. Bitter in the sense that, the church did not support the MNF movement because they reject the use of violence. And both parties, the MNF and the church, have used verses from the Bible to justify their standpoint. So the kind of exchanges that were happening between the church and the MNF from 1966 to 1971, it was a very, very bitter relationship. But in terms of the process of the vernacularization, I think the church played a very important role in terms of making much of traditional Mizo practices acceptable to the larger Mizo society. For example, the use of kwang, traditional drums, and maybe the celebration of festivals. Now, for example, today Chapcharkut is a very renowned festival which is celebrated across the state. But it was not until 1963 that it was that the church allowed the celebration. The church was against it. Now, in the context of vernacularization, I think much Christianity in its practice was indigenized in many ways. It was not that Mizos accept Christianity, Western Christianity as it is. They adapted in many ways, and it was a kind of Mizo version of Christianity that we have, which blend many things together. So in that way, particularly with the MNF also, they have a separate organizations that actually the MNF rebels themselves give, for example, tithe. They have their evangelicals, MNF. They were sending evangelicals in the Bangladesh, and many other areas. So in the process of vernacularization, I think the role of the church largely is evident when it comes to say print culture, because it is the church which have owned the printing press in Mizoram. And throughout the period of insurgency, also throughout the period of the movements, what we see is that in many ways they have aided the vernacularization of not only Christian practices but also much of Mizo identity consciousness as well. On the first question, in relation to why Burma. Now, Mizo Union was a party of the commoners, and their idea and objective, was to abolish chieftainship. Now, their political rivals was the United Mizo Freedom Organization, which was backed by the chiefs. Now, the chiefs, the chiefs, propagated the idea that we have ethnic similarities with people living the Chin Hills and Sagang region, and therefore it makes more sense for the Mizos to integrate with Myanmar or Burma. So that was the argument that they give. Now I think but one of the questions that you asked what explained the rise of MNF? I think that is something which is quite puzzling. But also because I think it was the way in which MNF were able to connect themselves with the people. For instance, they have undertaken massive mobilization, not only within Mizoram, but across Mizoram inhabited areas. They travel by foot. They were much of the leaders were educated. They were good orators, and at the same time, they have wherever they go, they have taken the kind of songs that raise the spirit of the people in terms of bringing them under the MNF fold. So by the 1963 and 64, what we see is that much of the younger generations, not only the illiterate class, but even the literate class who were studying in different parts of India, were being drawn into the ideology of the MNF. So I think by and large, the MNF ideology is, the rise of the MNF is to be credited into the kind of political culture and the kind of messages that they were being able to send through the use of songs.
Hi, thank you for the nice talk. I had just a very basic question because I'm not from the humanities background. But when you talk about songs, the way we perceive songs, the age groups, the generational differences that arise on how we perceive a given song, essentially not only for MNF or a general song. So how did it had any influence on the politics of MNF growth? Per se, how it was perceived by the youngsters versus the older generations, and how does it reflect in today's Mizoram community?
I think that is a very fundamental question, in a sense that how do the contemporary Mizo youth particularly relate themselves to the MNF movement. Now, so one is that the MNF emerged as a credible political party after the end of the movement, that is 1986. Now, post the 1986, what we have is that the MNF project itself as the guardian of Mizo nationalism. In a sense that they are the one who represent the political interests of the Mizos. That is how they would like to, how they position themselves. Now, in today's context, so in today's context, particularly the last few years, what we have seen is that the younger generations does not necessarily support the MNF ideology per se, or relate themselves to the MNF movement. But that does not mean that Mizos, the current generations, have become what is it? Less identity conscious, or something of that sort. So we see a lot of intergenerational gap between people who lived during the period of the movement, who were part of the movement, and the kind of concerns that are being articulated by current generations in Mizo society is very, very different. So because over a period of time, aspirations also change, and also the way in which contemporary younger Mizos relate themselves to the idea of India is also very different. So, for instance, in the 60s and the 70s, we used to hear our grandparents, telling us that, they are going to India, right? So the idea of India seems to be something which is distant. But today, that is not the case anymore, right? So it is not necessarily that, whether politics is there or not, but the way in which, things are moving, definitely it is, moving in a different direction.
Yeah, I think I can also give a quick comment on his questions. So, yeah, as far as today's contemporary, youth is concerned, like they are more of like thinking nationalism as the kind of people who are not going for corruptions or so on and so forth, who are like who want to go for, see, say for example, as far as nationalism is concerned in Mizoram, it's the MNF who said they are safeguarding all this sort of regional nationalism. So they pitch in such a way that it's too political. So the kind of narrative which is also going on in Mizoram is that people do respect the kind of nationalism that they are having it, but they prefer more of people. As far as political ideology is concerned, like it can go in the other way around, that it can be very corrupted. So people take it the other way around. So my questions for Puya is that, see, Mantupita already asked some part of the questions. So see, we have chief as institutions, village chiefs as an institutions. When Christianity come, we have church as another institutions. So this has given a lot of difference, because they have a freedom to to process something like the way the chief did. They'll go for a meeting, they will decide, they will have consensus, so on and so forth. Forget about the songs, musics, and everything. So I think this would also give a lot of impact to this, vernacular nationalisms. Say, for example, the church did not want, in the beginning, the church, object those traditional songs. But it's the Christian missionaries, say, for example, in the South, H.W. Carter, it's this guy who started all these kind of songs. Before, we know only the Christian songs and the traditional songs, which is quite different. So he started the songs of natures, the songs of all these Namla, so on and so forth. It's a Serkon concert which started all this. So I think if someone look at all these things from that lens, also it would be very interesting.
Thank you, Krista, for that. I think yes, you are very much right in your observation. There are for instance, I look at three genres like Party Ihla, Namla, and Rambo Ihla, but there are different versions. Right, Ramnga Ihla, for example, which I did not include it. So there is I think that is also a limitation to my own work also, that I could not engage with uh, you know beyond the three genres of law that I talk about in my book. So but I do know that bringing in more genres could have added value to my work and the book as well. But then I am also worried about the narrative that is also going to come out out of that if I bring in too many things. So but I think your point is well taken. But I do know that that was the comment that I received when I had my interaction with people from Mizoram as well when the book was out, that there are so many genres of yeah, yes, what is it? Yeah, the tune, yeah, the songs, yeah. So yeah, to an extent one can say that, but then for example Kai Lekla, right? So over a period of time, many common Mizos come up with their own, creative way to subvert, many things that were being imposed by the church, right? And Kai Lekla was one. In a sense, Kai Lekla basically is a parody song where, in the early years, when Mizos converted to Christianity, even young people were not allowed to sing love songs. Now, Kailagla emerged in that kind of context, where they pretend to sing love songs, but they were not actually, they pretend to sing gospel hymns, but they were not actually singing gospel hymns, but singing love songs. So in that way, the kind of innovation that emerged over a period of time, I think that is what is, the message of the book. Also, in a sense that, in the context of counterinsurgency, we have Rambuaita. In the context of democratic politics, we have Party Ita. In the context of the Mizo movement, particularly concerning the MNF, we have Nampla. So that is what essentially I try to do. But I think we can also, continue to have this conversation.
Okay, I think the Some comments. Yeah, I forgot the Zoom. Okay, there's one question by Pompey Baswantari. It will be very insightful if the speaker can go through can shed some light on the nature of field work that went in retrieving the oral narratives. This is the last question here. Then we can.
Okay. Thank you for that question, and thank you, for staying online. Well, retrieving the oral was, one of the biggest challenges that I face. One is, in terms of getting the original version of the songs. That the song, I have to go and find multiple sources to check whether I am getting the correct or original version of the songs. These songs were hardly written down, so I have to track different people, contact different persons. Now the other is that in terms of retrieving, the other is that there is a kind of collective amnesia as well, in a sense that memory is something which is very slippery, in a sense that people remember one event differently, right? Accounts, experience also varies. So in that kind of context, one does face a lot of challenge when we're trying to work with something like the oral, because narrations, experience, encounters, varies from individual to individuals. So, but what I have seen is also, that uh, it provides us to provide, a more deeper or a more, perceptive view or understanding about a movement, and it enable us to, oral narratives particularly enable us to bring in, the voices of the people that we study. So I think this is where I place and put my work, in a sense that it was the oral become the voice of the people in many ways, and it is them speaking, and in term and using the kind of language and terms that they use to to talk about the movement. So I think that is very important, but definitely there is a lot of challenges in terms of locating the original, the authenticity of the materials that I have used, so on and so forth. But I try to do my best, in terms of trying to cross-check different sources.
Okay, on that note, on that happy musical note, I would say, thank you so much, Dr. Puia, for coming and sharing your work with us. I think all of us have learned something from today's talk.